Good evening. We have reached lecture number 5 in our series on book and history. The weather looks good, and with luck we will get through the rest of these wonderful lectures without another snow day. Tonight, however, we are visiting the 17th century to learn about an aspect of papyrus to paperback that we all experience or are subjected to every day: modern journalism. As we'll do this with Professor Eileen Reeves as our guide. Professor Reeves, who is Associate Professor of Comparative Literature at Princeton, did her undergraduate work at Whitman College in Washington and received her PhD in Comparative Literature from Stanford. She taught at the University of Pennsylvania before coming to Princeton in 1993. Her book, Painting the Heavens, Art and Science in the Age of Galileo, was selected as the Outstanding Academic Book of 1997 by Choice Magazine. If we use the term Renaissance man for someone with a wide range of interests, I think we may have ourselves a Renaissance woman in Eileen Reeves, whose scholarly interests seem to have no bounds. She has written books, articles, reviews, and lectures on subjects as diverse and fascinating as sunspots, astronomy, journalism, optics, Galileo, early maps, John Donne, early economics, and lunar craters. The titles of many of these works are just wonderful, but the one that seems to me to be a perfect segue into tonight's topic is Jesuits on the Moon, Early Modern Tabloid Culture. I can picture that headline on the National Enquirer as I stand in the supermarket checkout line. So from the prayerful, pious books of ours of last week, let's move forward several centuries as Eileen Reeves discusses its views, 17th century origins of modern journalism. We've
got one number. And thank you for showing up at this hour, which was my bedtime. It's not yours. I'll be showing slides in a bit, but not straight away. And some of the slides are text.
Louder, please.
How do I do that? Does this work?
No, that's a light.
No. That's good. How do I make it closer to me other than
What we can do is make the sound. We can make it louder.
Oh, that's good. Does this work better?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. So I'll be showing you some text just because sometimes when you hear early modern text, it's annoying not to see the follow along. And then I'll be showing you a couple of images. News and idle chatter have always enjoyed an excessively cozy arrangement. So one might argue that in coming here tonight for a discussion of the emergence of journalism, that you've merely exchanged the vapid inanities of televised reports at 8 p.m. for a lecture on the social, economic, and technological processes by which institutionalized gossip became a respectable part of one's weekly or daily fare. And certainly the strictures against excessive news consumption date not to the early modern period, when serial journalism developed, but to antiquity. To choose two familiar examples, consider the dim view taken in the Acts of the Apostles, where the real novelty, and the only one worth discussing, was that of Christ's life and death. We learn in Acts 17, for example, of Paul's frustration in Athens with the Epicureans and the Stoics who resisted his proselytizing, and who eventually heard what he had to say only because they were intellectual newsmongers, or as scripture has it, because these Athenians and foreigners spend their time in nothing else but in telling or in listening to some new thing. The great philosopher Plutarch, born in Athens just as Paul made his unsuccessful visit to that city, would likewise criticize the thirst for novelty, and he attempted in his essay on curiosity to have those so afflicted to focus not on heaven, but on the heavens, for he regarded astronomical research as a great spectacle and the only socially acceptable form of newsmongering. Said he, "Direct your curiosity to heavenly things and things on earth, in the air, and in the sea. Are you by nature fond of great spectacles or small ones? If of great ones, apply your curiosity to the sun. Where does it set? Whence does it rise? Inquire into the changes of the moon, as you would that of a human being. These are the secrets of nature, and yet nature is not vexed with those who find them out. Thus Plutarch. But for most readers, the abstemious regime of astronomical study proposed by Plutarch simply did not serve as an acceptable surrogate for news. Celestial matters and terrestrial affairs were, however, related in the popular mind in an important forerunner and companion to the newsletter, the Almanac. Though it dates to antiquity, the Almanac flourished in the print revolution of the late 15th century, and because it offered specific sorts of advice about the near future, when eclipses would occur, when the weather would change, when major religious holidays and feast days were to be celebrated, and when bloodletting, baths, and haircuts were best undertaken, the Almanac was presumably of immediate use in many aspects of civil and domestic life. The predictive value of almanacs and news collections, that is, their cumulative ability to show long-term trends, is what the English statesman Dudley Carleton emphasized in 1616, somewhat self-consciously, when he reminded his friend John Chamberlain to save what others professed to use as fish wrap, that is, his old gazettes. And here we go with my first slide. Let's see.
I can do it.
Oh, no, I know that it needs to be just turned on. If you hit the light, I think that the first one's good to go. Let's find out. Okay, here's a little Dudley. Since you can be content with the gazettas, you shall have them by every messenger, and you need not send them back, though I will desire you to keep them, and that I make, and so have done so a long time, a collection of them, as some do of almanacs, to know the certainty of the weather, yet with not so great diligence as the Duke of Urbino, who had them in process of time from great antiquity. The Duke of Urbino is the great newsmonger and the great news collector to whom we owe all. Nobody took over him. The single prognostications of the almanac, rather than the picture that they presented collectively and over time, rapidly acquired a pronounced political and professional character, a trait shared with early news writings, and one quite at odds with the Roman Catholic Church's emphasis on free will and its hostility to astrological determinism. A papal bull issued by Pius V in mid-March 1572, less than 2 weeks before his death, was directed at all those who write, dictate, keep, transmit, and fail to destroy libelous pamphlets and these things called newsletters. Less than a year later, his successor, Gregory XIII, threatened those scandalmongers known as menanti, and those who accept their writers, and those copying and transmitting these libelous pamphlets. And he noted that such rumormongers dealt not just in a promiscuous and irrelevant blend of tale about the recent past, but also that they foolishly foretell what will come to be. By 1586, Sixtus V issued a bull against all who practiced judicial astrology and the consumers of their books. And though the specificity of the injunction suggests that almanac makers existed apart from news vendors, their association remained close in the popular mind, in part because at least some copyists seem to have trafficked in both sorts of texts. The tangled relationship of astrological predictions about the near future and news of the recent past is nicely emblematized in the exchanges between Gloucester and his bastard son Edmund and his true heir Edgar in King Lear, first performed in 1606. Recall that in Act 1, Scene 2, when Edmund seeks to persuade his father of Edgar's perfidious nature, he does so by showily concealing a fake private letter plotting the old man's death as Gloucester makes his entry. Gloucester's assumption that such missives necessarily contain faithful accounts of current events. Edmund, how now? What news? Is quite typical of the early modern thirst for the sort of information conveyed in handwritten letters from unnamed gentlemen of polity, and it predisposes him to believe that Edgar is both the writer and his would-be killer. What most convinces Gloucester of the truth of the preposterous letter, the impact of which other characters, nonplussed, refer to as strange news, is a set of prognostications concerning these late eclipses in the sun and the moon, an allusion which would have had particular resonance after the several eclipses in the fall of 1605. While Edmund has a bitter laugh over such astrological determinism in a subsequent soliloquy, he then makes a show of being absorbed in reading not a tragedy's end. The mutual involvement of news and prognostications appears as part of a pattern. In 1630, Galileo Galilei's mere presence in Rome inclined a news writer to allege, most improbably, that the famous astronomer and astrologer had let certain people know his predictions about the gender of an unborn baby in the Barberini family, about the approaching death of Pope Urban VIII, and about the strong prospects for peace that summer in northern Italy. Galileo is very apolitical. He would not have said anything like this. He's one person who does not care about news. A variant on this sort of story is one in which a celebrated astrologer living in Florence offers astute political pronouncements, that is, news just on the point of being consumed, as he makes his celestial observations, often in sotto voce fashion, as if a casual or unwilling initiator of this rumor. The most remarkable such instance concerned a certain unnamed Tuscan astronomer who allegedly foresaw the assassination of King Henri IV of France in 1610, the evening before the event. This was a widely circulated news story. A close analog, and one that likewise attributes to a Galilean figure some newsworthy pronouncements, appears in the Scottish work of 1635. In discussing comets, an omen traditionally associated with the death of a ruler or with regime change, we didn't say it as follows. The writer offered the following anecdote. Now I'll need slide 2, but that's my job, right?
No, she wants it now.
Oh, she wants it. Okay.
Good time.
Okay, let's see. Yeah, here we go. I, being at that time in Florence, where an Italian astronomer upon the third bridge, drawing in his cables the height and the aspect of the comet, was overheard by us who gazed upon him to cry, although with a low voice, Vai Germania, woe unto Germany. And whoso is but never so little acquainted with the histories of diverse nations shall soon perceive in them what lamentable accidents have ensued after extraordinary deluges and overflowings of waters and intolerable droughts, but more especially after the appearing of comets, what dreadful effects according to their affections. Readers would naturally have associated Galileo with this figure, especially after his protracted polemical exchanges about the natures of the comets of 1618. But, as it happens, Galileo was bedridden with arthritis for much of 1618, and he was unable to make astronomical observations from home, much less from the picturesque public venue depicted here. There's a certain cavalier inattention to the details of the phenomenon. The writer identified the object of this astronomer's attention as that blazing star, which appeared in 1618, rather than the 3 comets that emerged that fall. It's not clear, finally, why this astronomer offered his private and spontaneous speculation in something other than vernacular, and in the one language, Latin, that he shared with his foreign observers. But these sorts of inconsistencies are typical of such stories, where the crucial issue is the presumed political relevance and accessibility of these astronomical observations to a public hungry for news. Now, thus far, I have treated early modern news as a single entity because the symbiosis between different genres seems to me of crucial importance. But it would be unwise to neglect the real distinctions that obtained here. In what follows, I will offer first a very brief overview of the emergent industry, and then a discussion of the relationship of elite news readers to a larger public, and of different sorts of news writers to each other. Though both manuscript newsletter services for privileged subscribers and printed news accounts of sensational events flourished more or less independently of each other in the early 16th century, and though the Latin Mercurius Gallo-Belgicus had been in existence since 1594, it was not until the early 17th century that printed news books or news sheets, widely available in certain urban areas and perhaps well beyond, costing relatively little to those who purchased them and nothing at all to those many people who heard them read aloud or who received them second or third hand, emerged as periodical publication. The chronology, though subject to some debate, and news journalists, historians debate this endlessly, but here's how it goes. The chronology typically placed the first such serialized printed works in Strasbourg in 1605, in Wolfenbüttel 1609, in Basel in 1610, in Frankfurt and Vienna 1615, 1617, in Hamburg and Amsterdam, 1618, Antwerp, 1620, London, 1621, Delft, 1623, I'm getting to the end, Paris, 1631, by Lake, The Hague, 1635, Florence, 1636, and Genoa in 1639. You'll notice there's no reference to, for instance, Rome, Venice. I'll get to that. There's some silences here. These early printed newsletters and newsbooks usually emerged every week or every fortnight and offered an assortment of relatively brief reports from other cities rather than the narration of a single freakish event, which had been the format of the past. Produced on poor quality paper and with modest attention to typographical and stylistic presentation, the newsletters, or corantos or gazetas, ran from 1 to 12 sheets and usually had some sort of consistent title indicating the place and date of publication. Conventions about the order of the individual news items varied, but the general progression seems to have been from those reports sent from the most distant points, that is, the scale list, to those of nearer in place and time. And often they left a little blank section at the very end where you could fill in local news closest to your home and heart. The last paragraphs of the newsletter, often more miscellaneous in character, reflected the latest, the most recent additions to the text. Though the English appear to have preferred the format of a small quarto printed newsletter or quarante book, the earliest of their productions, as well as those of the French, both printed in Amsterdam, retained many of the original Dutch features. And I'll show you some stuff in Dutch, which is, that would be slides 3 and 4, which is, let's see, is this on me or should I press it?
Yes.
So that's what a Dutch one, the front page and the back page. And then because I assume that we don't have a ton of people reading Dutch, I'll move quickly to the French one. Here, for example, is the original version of the Corato, printed in Amsterdam in September 18, 1620, with stories from Rome, Venice, Vienna, Prague, Frankfurt, the camp of Marquis Ambrogio Spinola, Oppenheim, and finally the camp of the Prince of Orange, the Dutch military leader. Let's see, slides 5 and 6. This will be in French.
Still Dutch.
That's still Dutch. This is, I'll show you that's the front page, which is virtually a translation of the Dutch, though probably written not by native speakers, but back page. Here's the French translation of that issue. The viewpoint remains that of the Dutch. When they say notre or nous, they're talking about the Dutch. A quick scan of the first paragraph of this version will reveal a very typical inattention to spelling. Spinola's name, for instance, is spelled 3 different ways in the first paragraph. This is also true for the contemporaneous English versions printed in Amsterdam, some of which are written in an amusing Anglo-Dutch patois, which was a parody on the stage. It's, some of the, in order to capture, because Amsterdam was the depot for English and French news before they moved to London and Paris, it came out of Amsterdam, the most authentic news. In order to capture the authenticity, sometimes the writers even accentuated the Dutch quality, so it's more like reading Dutch than like English. The more foreign they look, the more legitimate they look. Historians of journalism have found it useful to distinguish between these printed items and the many manuscript newsletters that flourished alongside them during the 17th century. And in many circumstances, such distinctions were and are crucial. Manuscript newsletters, even those produced in many copies and widely circulated, would have enjoyed less propagation than their printed analogs. They were sometimes directed to a small list of subscribers who had the requisite capital, power, energy, and ambition to inform themselves more fully, if not more accurately, than those who bought or merely listened to printed news sheets, or who availed themselves of gazettes enjoying broader circulation. News writers directing their information to a restricted audience distinguished themselves occasionally from these gazettes and their readers. Shortly after the assassination of Henri IV, for example, example, someone in the employ of the Duke of Urbino wrote from Anglophile and anti-papal Venice that some fine minds say that the King of England, James I, has been killed too, and the gazettes here are full of this, but few believe it. And to season this sorrow, they add another, that the Pope, called a fifth, is either dead or dying. The writer of the manuscript news, especially in Venice and Rome, where printed serial news was very late to be established, operated for the most part with the connivance and even the cooperation of the authorities, many of whom relied on the restricted individual circuits of information provided by these men. In England, where the Crown made sporadic attempts to control printed news, manuscript newsletters containing more volatile political information seem to have been less regulated, though the extent of and reasons for this apparent tolerance are by no means clear. In France, a number of prominent literary figures offered with varying degrees of formality and insider's news to a circle of correspondence, often with explicit reference to the inferiority of printed accounts. In other words, when you're offering manuscript news, one way to enhance the product is say, guess what, get a load of what they're saying in the streets. Get the printed people know nothing. Here's the real inside look. A close look at both production and consumption of early modern news militates, however, against always treating the printed serial and the manuscript newsletter in isolation or apart from the neighboring genres of pamphlets, broadsides, separates, and private letters. Manuscript newsletters were typically the source or basis of their printed counterparts, the latter frequently offering, for reasons of time, space, and political expediency, a blander and cruder version of the original report. This sort of borrowing was sometimes emphasized or even fabricated. Printed accounts in weeklies and in separates were often presented as the private letters of gentlemen of quality. You never say, I got this information from a drunk or a warmonger, except in a play. That's a common motif in a play, but it's always unnamed gentlemen of quality. The direction of the flow of information from manuscript to print and from a restricted diffusion to a wider audience appears on occasion to have been reversed. In private correspondence between elite consumers of news, for instance, information taken from printed sources often serves simply as a marker of the distance between the sorts of things the writers knew and believed and the cruder fictions available to the masses. Elsewhere, however, such information retained most or all of its original value, as when French letter writers copied printed canals into their personal correspondence, or when English language courantos originally printed in the Netherlands were handwritten by entrepreneurs eager to retail them in England. In other words, there's a sort of technological regression here. You go from printed to written on occasion, normally the other way. It's worth noting that the interest of a well-informed elite in the kind of news available to a more general public was marked by a certain social anxiety. Thus, Peter Paul Rubens, writing from Antwerp in 1626 and renowned as a diplomat and as a painter, sought from a friend in Paris copies of public news sheets, but of the better sort and at my expense, before adding, I'm sorry not to have the same commodity here where news writers are not used, such that everyone informs himself as best as he can, though there's no shortage of storytellers and charlatans who publish in print certain reports that are not worthy of being seen by gentlemen. I do what I can to inform myself, but not with such bagatelles. Rubens' request is somewhat surprising, for at that point, Antwerp had printed periodicals and Paris did not. But it is clear that his interest lay with what some part of the public read. His choice to end this rather stiffly worded request for the news sheets with a line from the Aeneid, untranslated of course, doubtless reflects a wish to distinguish himself in cultural and intellectual terms from this larger audience of news readers, even from those Latin readers who could tolerate the harsh and uncouth style of the Mercurius Gallo-Belgicus, as a Latin language newspaper that circulated, it was meant to be a lingua franca to circulate throughout Europe. Mostly derided, most of what we know of is not very flattering. Other elite news readers portrayed their avid consumption of what was available to the populace as a sin of the past, a peccadillo that could now be renounced with ease. In In 1653, Jean-Louis Gouès de Balzac, who had written letters widely celebrated for their stylish communication of current events in the 1620s and 1630s, and who had seen them reprinted and translated into a number of languages in numerous editions in the subsequent decades, and who had even defended the Parisian Gazette in 1636 from mocking verses from the Netherlands, offered at last a meditation on a kind of retreat from all news, a position which naturally involved an explicit rejection of the French journal's founder, the late Théophile Renaudot. In what he called a preface to the history of the next month, or the pleasures of the retired life, Gouès de Balzac began his fantastical reverie by recalling that an ambassador of his acquaintance had once spoken of an enchanted castle whose residents had neither calendars, nor clocks, nor chimes, no workdays and no holidays, and never heard either good news nor bad. Balzac assured his correspondents that he could not do without bells and their regulation of civic and religious life, but that he could indeed dispense with news. Let's see if I can show you what he said. Yeah, here we are. Truly, if you wanted to make me happy, you would ban everything that goes by the name of Collation, Gazette, Ordinaire, Extraordinaire, and so forth. I had the greatest admiration for Monsieur Renaudot, and I praised him long ago. But since Plato chased Homer out of his Republic after having crowned him with flowers and anointed him with perfumes, Monsieur Renaudot will not be offended if, for conditions favorable to our peace of mind, we close the door to him with all sorts of civilities, after having said of him that he is the most eloquent of modern historians, that France in some way owes him her great reputation, and that if she had lost him, she would have been hard put to find someone to replace him. The apparent ease with which Balzac dismissed Renaudot, founder of French journalism, depended upon his several allusions to the potential availability of information restricted to a more elite public. In this exercise of reverse snobism, what passed for timely news in the Collation and the Gazette was beneath the notice of ambassadors and courtiers whose thorough familiarity with such information allowed them to transfer their attention to the retardataire world of enchanted castles where time itself has ceased to exist. This image is also a casual revision of both the conventional literary depiction of the entrepôt of sensitive information destined for the intelligentsia, those castles where rumors good and bad and true and false converge, and of the historical fact that the individuals most likely to live in such settings, members of European courts, were among the earliest subscribers to manuscript newsletters as well as to printed news. Despite the heavy irony of his comparison of Homer to Renaudot, and by extension of the enduring splendor of the epic to the ephemeral weekly smudge that was the Gazette, Balzac's anxiety about the place of serial news within the state is genuine. For he recognized that newsprint, because of its widespread dissemination and its relentless chronicling of the quotidian, offered a novel basis for historical writing. The character of historical writing did change very much in function of this record that came out. To the extent that simplistic, erroneous, mendacious, or politically motivated accounts of the recent past had any impact or efficacy, France did indeed in some way owe a great reputation to Renaudot. It's clear that there was an increasing interest on the part of well-informed news consumers in the impressions an amorphous public had about current events, in the manner in which such low people came by their information, in the impact of wide availability upon the solitary work of interpretation, and in the alarming porosity of public and private discourses. This was a whole new area of social concern. What the masses are doing with this kind of information. The French scholar Gabriel Naudet, for his part, portrayed news consumption in 1620 as a kind of malicious and transparent civic spectacle, one where popular participation was only a mirage. Go to another slide.
Oh, no.
Oh, no. These pamphlets would better be burned than exposed to view. These centos, colloquies, avvisi, letters, echoes, harangues, remonstrations, and others of this sort. These things which people pull from their pockets, pass only to their friends and sell in secret. They cost quite a lot and are worth nothing, and are poorly made, as if coming from the hands of a crude, ignorant, and unpolished populace. One which has let itself be led like wooden puppets whose strings are moved by others. Consider this connection, no, it's fine, we can go forward. Consider this connection an engraving of about 1630. The Pamphletenverkoper, or the newsvender, the work of Jan Joris van Vliet, a sometime collaborator of Rembrandt. Here a crowd variously composed of wealthy, middling, and poor citizens gathers about a vendor and his assistant who reads aloud. Someone on your left, let's see, we'll look at the whole thing first, which is also on the back of the someone on your left with a market basket proceeds toward the pair as if to acquire this perishable commodity of news as well. A thuggish little girl, accompanied by her mother, appears to be withholding a broadsheet from a crippled fellow ex-soldier, and in the foreground a couple of pickpockets set upon a rich burger, too intent upon what he is hearing to notice them. I can back it up. It may be easier for me than for you. There we go. Van Vliet's engraving is a typical depiction of the extraordinary appeal and seeming relevance the news had to most strata of early modern Dutch society. Its details, however, suggest a more complicated view of the news consumer, in which it's not the sort of happy festival where we all converge on current information relevant to the well-neighbored republic. Consider the central muddle of bodies just below the steeple. A big, functionless fellow in a cape of sorts adopts an odd posture. His feet turn to your right, his head to your left. A mismatch underscored by the difference between his entirely crude face and his elegant lower limbs. Whoever or whatever he is, he blocks our view of the head of someone rather small who reaches up to grab a broadsheet. The position of 3 sets of legs below further confuses the matter, for the flexed feet on your right should logically belong to the short, headless customer whose hands strain upward for the pamphlet, but clearly the flat feet to your left are more in line with his body. And the pickpocket, just below the window on the far right, possesses the most peculiar footwear yet. His legs terminate in something like hooves. What this part of the engraving lacks in realistic visual coherence, it gains from 2 very common early modern figures of speech. Crowds were routinely described as belvum motorum practicum, a many-headed beast. And this undifferentiated mass of humanity was also paradoxically composed of headless individuals, meaning masterless men answerable to no one, clearly embodied by the pickpocket in the lower right corner, and arguably by that unseen news consumer whose straining body dominates the center of the composition. Equally curious, therefore, are the titles of the broadsheets that so animate this crowd. Let's see, now we I hope that's illegible. Well, it's not meant to be, that's the point. While some of the letters appear to belong to a Roman alphabet, O, N, W, and I, others are swirls and inversions, and no collection of them spells an actual Dutch word, much less a Dutch title. Van Vliet portrays writing as an elaborate code in other contexts, but here its very abstruse nature seems to insist upon newsprint as something beyond the grasp of these bestial consumers, or available to them only as a fleeting oral communication. The engraving endures, print does not. I'd like to turn from these early news consumers to those who made it a marketable item. Some of the attention devoted to other purveyors of news is simply due to professional rivalry. In 1615, the mercurius Gallo-Belgicus gestured to all those pamphlets, some libelous and some ridiculous, that had threatened the peace in 1608. And in 1614, the Mercure François alluded to the imprisonment and death of Morgal, the master almanac maker, and inveighed against astrological prognostications. and in 1633, the Swedish intelligencer exhibited a new diffidence about the publications upon which it sometimes depended, telling the reader in the preface that it only relied upon eye and ear witnesses. These publications routinely cannibalized each other, and they just as routinely said, never touch this stuff. But it's also the case that those who produced manuscript newsletters for more restricted audiences alluded more favorably to others in the same trade who apparently performed different functions in the propagation of information about current events. Thus, a newsletter written in March 1609 from Rome and destined for the Duke of Urbino closed with a hasty scrawl, quote, "The novelista came here to tell me that the Venetians have brought bricks and other materials to make a tower on the sluice that they have made on the Po, and that His Holiness Pope Paul V was not pleased with the papal legate to Ferrara, who had written nothing of this news." Unquote. Though the emphasis here would seem to be on the subterfuges and the silence of the papal legate, rather than on any access to privileged information enjoyed by the novelista, in other circumstances, the news writers in the employ of the Duke of Urbino referred to the well-placed informants on whom they depended. In a letter sent from Neustadt in Austria in 1614, the news writer assured the Duke that he was well loved by the Belgian Jesuit Bartholomew Willer, confessor to Habsburg Archduke Ferdinand II, and that he daily received confidences from him. The Jesuits heard the confessions of all the archdukes, so they would hear about what they were planning to do as well. It was a good source. The motif of the political meddling of Jesuit confessors and of other members of the order working at courts was a familiar one in Protestant polemical literature, and an ongoing concern for the superior general of the society in Rome, and a constant in news of the dead. The Duke's news writers also reported to him with some frequency on the dangers and the death of those who gathered and disseminated news, and perhaps they passed on these insights in the hope of securing a bonus for their own efforts. Thus, in late February 1608, the Duke was told that, on Monday, 8 of those who engage in the profession of adizia news were imprisoned for having written in their pages that our Lord had granted a dispensation to the Duke of Savoy so that parties could be given, weddings performed, and meat eaten, and things like that during this Lenten season, which is wholly false and a deliberate lie. On Thursday morning, the 3 of them who confessed to writing this were sent to the galleys for 5 years, and the others, judged innocent, were freed the night before. These news writers also relayed dispassionate reports of the professional irresponsibility, the imprisonment, and the death of the almanac maker Mogal and his printer in February 1614. And in August of the same year, those in Rome sent 3 accounts of the decapitation of a pamphleteer from Rimini. Chilling in their brevity, and these are in handwritten manuscript reports. It's really quite stunning to see them. These reports differ slightly in details about the display of the decapitated torso. All recorded the victim's name and birthplace, and all agreed that the body bore the inscription "for libelous pamphlets." But one mentioned that the deceased was placed for public view in the usual place, on the Ponte Sant'Angelo, and added that 2 bundles of the fatal works were attached to the display, and another noted that the killing had taken place in the jail of the Torre di Nona in Rome, and the third related 2 burning torches illuminated the post-mortem scene. And this is repeated with some regularity in manuscript news. Another one got killed, and the usual place, which is perhaps the most chilling phrase of all. The Duke and other subscribers to manuscript newsletters received finally the occasional reminder of the danger with which these menanti, or news writers themselves face for making too explicit, unpopular information. Most such allusions would simply reside in the cryptic brevity characteristic of these texts. The manuscript newsletters have sort of bullet points of information. Though at least one news writer seeking to enliven the endless tedium of reporting on the pomp, festivities, and delays leading up to a princely marriage in 1608 with something more like fear, intrigue, and stealth, gamely resorted to a kind of bombastic, teeth-chattering timorousness. In the notice beginning from someone else from Mantua, who knows something, he wrote, I'll show you what he wrote. This is easily the most foolish thing. I want to say something about this marriage of Francesco Gonzaga to Margarita Savoy, but my lips are sealed. I will tell you only that there has been a delay, which, for those who know, is not at all what they believe it to be in the piazza. I don't know what to say. I am afraid, and I am afraid, and I could say it 1,000 times, I'm afraid. But it's not just a question of the wedding, but of something worse. This Gordian knot can't fail to come undone, though in my view, it has by now been sliced through. When I can tell you something, I will. I think this guy was fired after that because these are all bound together, and I didn't see his handwriting to get after that. And it's very loquacious for manuscript use. And very empty, I think you'll agree. I'd like to turn by way of conclusion to the convergence of optics and news in the early modern period. That news should have been imagined in visual terms is in many ways surprising, for it's certain that consumers often heard rather than read about current events. Nor were these auditors necessarily either those who were unable to read or those so incurious as to be satisfied with short oral recapitulations. A poem by Michelangelo Buonarroti the Younger, the nephew of the artist, written around 1632, and thus just a few years before the establishment of printed serial news in Florence, implies that in this city, as in many others, gazettes were routinely read aloud to larger sections of the public. And the poem translated and awkwardly goes like this. And until another star takes me from these narrow city walls where the limits of my life are so tightly bound, I will sit in a circle listening to gazettes that now Mainz has been taken, now Cologne, that Sweden is putting the bit on Germany, and whether that king wants the scepter in Poland or just to hold the empire in check. Gabriello Chiabreras al Signor Giovanni Francesco Geri, written several decades earlier, likewise depicts a crowd composed of both nobility and merchants gathered in Florence waiting for fresh letters brought by the courier from France and eventually hearing the news from Lyon, Paris, and the Netherlands. And even those who spent their time reading and writing the news, as for example the poet and sometimes diplomat Fulvio Testi, understood the distillate of those lengthy written exchanges as commodities within an oral culture, writing from Turin in 1630, when much of northern Italy had become and would continue to be for 30 years more a battleground for Spain and France. Fulvio Testi noted that rumors of quiet are resounding everywhere, and the hopes of this exhausted region are increased by the agreement between the different avvisi. The emphasis upon the oral propagation of news, however, does not erase either a consumer's awareness of the text from which resounding rumors of quiet emerge, or the conventional fiction which closed the gap between well-written words and vivid images of remote scenes. I should say in passing, it's a very common figure of speech to compare news to telescopic vision. To show you pretty good images of far away and lousy close at hand. You can usually say what was reported about events locally was not good or fuzzy or vague. And also because the Dutch inflection, because the Dutch telescope obviously emerged in the Netherlands, the news was portrayed as a version of telescopic vision, and then when the telescope seemed to be sort of too untrustworthy and news alike, then we had an early version of the camera doesn't lie. News was portrayed as something sort of piped into a camera obscura. And this is a very common literary motif in most letters. Many individual writers who presented the epistolary exchange as akin to the telescope, letters and lenses alike offering a picture of sorts of a distant personal object, and perhaps found the motif particularly appropriate when they did not have much news to share, for the emphasis seems to fall upon the transparency and the clarity and the candor of their correspondence, rather than upon the vivid realism of the scenes described, as in the case of commercial newsletters. The figure of the speech of the newsletter as telescope reached its logical limits, it would seem, in 1635 in the hands of Thomas Hobbes, who he was paid to be a tutor, but also a news writer. I think he was pretty good as a tutor. Miserable supplier of news. He admitted in one melancholy letter to Sir Gervase Clifton, whose son he was tutoring in Paris, that he would write more often if he had either any curiosity about news or any luck in writing it. And he began to close yet another newsless missive in this fashion. Let's see. I'll show you Hobbes. Here we go. No news nor service I can do you, but the ambition to remain in your memory hath produced this letter, which is an acknowledgement of your favors, a confession under my hand of my great obligation to you. If you believe this, my letter will have the effect of a perspective glass telescope, which shows you not only a tower or far off in growth, but also the battlements and the windows and other principal parts distinctly, as this shows you my principal quality, gratitude, by which I only pretend to your good opinion and the honor to be esteemed. And he goes on to say, sorry, I don't have to say this, but I'm really devoted to you. Flourishing alongside the fiction of the transparent communication of information was the notion that the medium, whether textual or optical, so strongly shaped the message that their separation was difficult. The recognition that a significant portion of the news read by early modern audiences often originated in alien linguistic, cultural, and confessional circumstances would have undercut or at least compromised the fantasy of the neutral transfer of such information. But the very fact that these transfers took place, that is, that coherent images of distant regions were routinely conveyed to consumers a world away, suggested that some limited faith in the validity of the medium was clearly warranted. I'd like to close with a late 17th century print which insists on the complex and ongoing relationship of the optical medium and the journalistic message. Giuseppe Maria Vitelli's, and the title is The Courier in the Distance Awaited by Those Crazed with War. And I'll show you several others of Vitelli first. It's one of several that Vitelli devoted to news consumption. Another shows a Frenchman and a Spaniard coming to blows while listening to news being read publicly. That's off to the side on your right is the Frenchman and the Spaniard duking it out over whether or not the news is legit. And here's my favorite of it. This one features strangely exhausted consumers offering histrionic protests to the news vendor. I don't want to hear any more news. No, we're sick of it. Beat it. We're fine without it. This is like, but reminds me of my kids. That's what they call. This is the one I want to comment on. This is Vitelli's The Courier in the Distance, Awaited by Those Crazed with War. This print of 1692 shows 8 men pointing to 2 horses on the horizon of Bologna and commenting on what sort of information they expect to obtain and on what bets they have placed. 3 of them observed the approach of the horseman through spyglasses. The first of these declares, "Seems like a German courier to me," while the second replies, "To me he looks French." And the third retorts, "Surely the courier of Spain." The differences evoked by the telescopic observers seem above all significant. None of these 3 men, indeed none in this unkempt and thuggish group, appear the embodiment of reason, vigor, or acuity. All idle in that featureless plane in the frenzied passivity so conventionally associated with newsmongers in that age. The slouching trio equipped with spyglasses in particular seems a comic version of the Austrian, French, and Spanish soldiery whose exploits they follow, as if to acknowledge that optical devices and the wasteland surrounding them were a crucial common denominator shared with the militia, both sides having spied on each other with spyglasses and pursued scorched earth policy in Piedmont and in the Dauphiné. Couriers arriving in Bologna in 1692 invasion of the Dauphiné. Mitteli suggested that each observer saw what he pleased may well have corresponded to the actual situation in Bologna in the spring and summer campaigns of 1692. Their reliance on these glasses to determine the nationality of the courier is especially interesting, for to recognize the horseman's country of origin, and by extension, something of the tenor of the news he carried, is, in a sense, to perform an extremely cursory reading of the incoming information. The familiar analogy between reading and using these optical devices, moreover, finds an interesting development in the very materials of which late 17th century Italian telescopes and books were both composed. And I'll show you. These are terrestrial telescopes. They're pretty lousy. It's unfortunate that historians of science are not especially interested in these because they don't render good quality, but how they're made is what I want to get at here. My interest is in the rather modest materials of which cheap spyglasses, such as those in Mitteli's print, were composed. The pasteboard of which these tubes were made was much more likely to have already served another previous purpose as the surface on which a text had once been written. Put differently, in the case of less expensive instruments, such as those depicted here, old and discarded manuscript or printed news offered the physical means of spying out the latest installment of current information. In other words, the tube there is made of old newspapers and covered sometimes with leather if you kind of went upstairs. Mitteli's image suggests then that the ephemeral nature of news makes visible and legible more recent reports. And it's not surprising to find in his earlier prints devoted to the subject that a bonfire seems the best means to end the obsessive interest in the Ottoman Empire. This is a print by Mitteli in which somewhere in there he's burning things in his own works. There's something, I can't make it up from this angle, but one of the things that's on the bonfire are his own drawings and prints. So it's a print selling the combustion of his earlier prints. But let me go back to this one. This print offers the most important meditation on the function of those short-lived documents. The newest news can only be seen with the telescope, and the telescope itself may be composed literally, figuratively, of old news. The late 17th century conflation of the optical medium and the journalistic message embodied in the courier in the distance was a long time coming, but always visible on the horizon. Thank you.
Where would what look like those political cartoons? Where would they have been?
Mitteli's were printed in Bologna or Venice. By that point, Venice had always been an important printing center, but that's one of the interesting things about Venice's failure to get printed news out. But by that point, Venice has a printed news industry as well. And so I'm not sure if Mitteli is more associated with Bologna, but it's either Bologna or Venice. And there was a huge trade in news about these sort of battle accounts. And they came out in little quartos and little books.
What kind of medium would it have been in? Where would have people seen them?
Oh, these prints?
Yeah. Some were commissioned, and no, they would have seen them all over. He did big runs on them. I don't think that they were often in books. I mean, Mitteli did work for book publishers too, but I think they were sold as separates. And one of the things that illustrators found as a kind of way of moonlighting if they didn't have a good commission was battle plans. They maybe were not especially interested in that, but that was another thing that they could do that sort of went alongside. And I think in the bonfire, there were also battle plans and sort of pictures of forts and sort of war stuff that people collected obsessively. I think mostly male people. It's not As the mother of small boys, that would be my initial reaction. But yes, so there was a lot of visual material that went alongside and was recycled. Like every time you had a war at a certain fort or something, you'd haul out that old picture. And so there was a certain kind of recycling of that news. And they went alongside the printed accounts, but were of slightly higher quality. I mean, Telly is very good, very popular. Yes?
Who were the early news writers?
Well, it's a hard question. We know the names of some, particularly in England. But for instance, the ones that wrote for the Duke of Urbino in Italy were clearly not native writers of Italian. They may have been Germans, and we don't know how they were even, hired. And they certainly were not hired because they had good handwriting. That there's not a kind of, even though in some industries there's people that do copy and that's their thing, the people who generate the news and sort of pass it on don't have any skills in sort of scribal hand. In England, there are different ones. There's some captains, and they're made fun of. We have fairly good information about, mostly from English comedy, because comedy and news are always sort of competing and playing off of each other, and they both are topical. And so there's certain captains, so especially since the 30 Years' War is starting, you need someone who can kind of talk the talk about battles. There's, as far as I know, there are very few women in any of this. The fiction is always, they're gentlemen of quality, they're sort of, or Jesuits or something like that. But the people that we actually know were, sort of mid-level people. The exception would be in France. There are much higher placed individuals with a literary background. But it's hard to sort of generalize. And what we know of some, we only know because they got killed, we've talked about, the way in which they were decapitated. So they're identified in that way. But how we first recruited them, particularly in Italy, is not at all known, except that they weren't Italians in general. They seem to have probably been Germans.
At one time, the way the news would come back to the nobility was from sea captains, which was where the tradition of a very detailed log would come from. This news is almost disparaged as being more of a gossip, more of a rumor. So was the nobility listening to one set of news brought back very formally, and then the quote-unquote the rabble was listening to the rumor?
Well, that's always the fiction, but the nobility, one of the things that interests me, and historians tend to focus on one stratum. So they say, oh, I do, high-class news, or I do the trash, or whatever, I do the broadside. But what interests me is the nobility's interest in the lower stratum, like that obsessive need to know what your social and economic inferiors believed. That seems to me more remarkable a phenomenon. The nobility, since 15th century, I think, had also relied on bankers' letters, particularly from the Fugger banking house, and those went with some regularity. So there were sort of manuscript circuits that were well established and had kind of postal routes. And yeah, there'll always be this thing of, this is what the real inside joke is, don't believe what's on the street. And the printed news accounts do have to say, week after week, last week we said so-and-so was dead, but apparently he's not. There's a remarkable kind of, people are cats of 9 lives. People come back. It's like a soap opera or something. They got it wrong an awful lot in the printed accounts. So yes, there's much to make fun of, especially if you have, access to some of this higher information. But I don't think that the strata are so discrete as historians like to maintain. I think there's also some bottom feeding that people are interested in the kind of low down and dirty news as well. Yes, over here, yes.
What percentage of the population in the 1600s were actually literate? Because you talked about most people heard these newsletters read out loud. I mean, was it more educated, like a very small population?
It's a very small, we have trouble defining literacy because people could read but not write or vice versa, or you could sign your name for a kind of some sort of event, but that doesn't mean that you could write all the time, or you could maybe read a word or two. So it's very hard to establish, but literacy is fairly low. Higher in urban areas, certainly higher amongst men than women. Higher, it correlates roughly, probably with one of the arguments is with Protestantism, and this sort of reading your own Bible. I don't know if I buy that, but that's one argument. And of course, certainly, if you were an artisan, someone that, especially if you make sort of high-class luxury goods, you're more likely to be literate. That's one of the arguments. But there's a ton of people who their only access to news is oral, and news was read, not just cried at the corner in an official way. That happened in France, but news was read out loud, as in Buonarroti's poem or in Chiabrero's. We have casual references in poetry to people, sort of propagating news, and it's not just the people who have no other access to it. It was kind of a public ritual. And in England, particularly if you go to St. Paul's in London, that's meant to be a big, huge news walk. So if you wanted to know something, typically if a big church and the Bourse, the financial center, and the Rialto in Venice would be places where you went to get news. So you could hear it in kind of informal fashion there, but there would also be, I think, some sorts of public readings. So yeah, I think you could have fairly good access to news and no literacy, as we define it. And you would understand news, I think, relatively well. You wouldn't be terribly sophisticated in your analysis, but you would understand a fair amount without being able to read a single thing. In other words, they can have a whole sort of trickle-down effect that is not just that of who could immediately analyze that visual information. Yes, thank you.
This, in essence, sounds like a tabloid type of press. Was there a legitimate press that went along with it at the same time?
Well, tabloid, we used that actually just for format originally. Yeah, I mean, these tried to distinguish themselves, the ones that I showed you, the Dutch and the French, they tried to distinguish themselves because if you really wanted tabloid, you get the one-offs, the separates that have things, the two-headed baby born or, some sort of astrological event. And they come out whenever the weird thing happens, rather than with the regularity. There's no, the expectation of these courantos is that every week or every 2 weeks there's stuff that's happening that's of concern to the whole populace.
They were legitimate in some
They were fairly legitimate, but that said, they're the ones that always have to say, we were wrong, the guy didn't die. Or there's sort of speculation. It tends to be from the Dutch Protestant viewpoint, so they'll have something snide to say, usually about Catholics. But they don't go overboard. I mean, there is much, much worse. There's also seasons, just like we have seasons here, sort of the silly season. Well, we have that all the time now, but in theory, there's this sort of dry seasons for news here. And they had those in Europe as well. That was acknowledged when the court was away, or in the summer, people were too tired to do anything. Or in the very cold weather, when it was too cold to conduct wars. So there were sort of seasons in which the news came out at the weekly or 2-week intervals, but there really wasn't much there. They considered themselves fairly legitimate compared to down and dirty trash, which I could show you. Real slime and heavily illustrated, as you can imagine. Yes, right here.
When they gave the guy 5 years in the galley for doing something, or they killed them in the usual place, who would do that? Would that be the authorities? What,
That's the
government?
authorities. That's the authorities. Now, sometimes in the case of Morgal, the almanac maker, that's the biggest, most famous one, the French almanac maker. He was, or Guillaume Globule is another one, a French political analyst. He was protected by a lot of people. In other words, his political information was on the mark. He was, but he just defended people. Yeah, the authorities would step in, and if you didn't have the right protectors, then you were gone. And you would have, in England, they had clampdowns on the press in the early years of serial press, at least 2 waves of censorship, and so they would destroy your presses. So, the early news vendors tried to set up presses in parallel, so you could have 2 going at once. You could have kind of print run that's more efficient, and they would just come in and destroy everything. And if you were a book printer principally, if that's what you mostly did was print books, and you did this on the side, then you were in a lot of trouble. Renaudot in France was the creature of Richelieu, so no one ever, I mean, he did Richelieu's bidding, no one ever went after him. He was reviled. Everyone mocked him the way I assume that many of us mock certain unnamed news networks today. But I mean, Renaudot was not taken down by the authorities. But in Italy, sure, anyone associated like with the papal courier they would take care of these guys at the Torre di Roma and then expose them to the usual place of Sant'Angelo. Yeah, it's the authorities. Yes.
Were these self-serving commissions by nobility? Who paid for these papers? To give them their point of view to the public.
The authorities didn't like, in most cases, the printed gazettes, with the exception of in France, because that's a sort of a state organ. The nobility paid for the manuscript news services, and they would often pay a guy not so much for the information, but to guarantee that he would only distribute it to 5 people. They're paying for sort of an elite list. But no, the ones that I showed you, the printed ones, they're a legitimate business concern, and so it's people. It's just like a book printer. I mean, it is a book printer. Some of these guys did time in jail. One of the more prominent ones in Amsterdam printed libelous pamphlets, and so even though the Amsterdam was meant to be relatively free, as that the Pamflettenverkoop or the news vendor print would suggest that everybody participated in news. Every once in a while, you'd overstep the mark, and the authorities would come after you and shut down your enterprise. There was a lot of, as in other professions, when anybody was widowed, and she would marry someone else in the profession. So there was sort of kind of a lot of intermarriage of people who had been rival news printers. But that was an ongoing business concern, as opposed to nobility, people at the courts paying to have this sort of secret information. There's a distinction there, though they say sometimes the same things. Yes, back here.
You indicated that in the early 1600s it was just starting. Somewhere in the 1700s it becomes legitimate. There's libel laws, guards against people just really writing anything. So there's about 100 years where it's a free-for-all, 50 years?
Yes, I hadn't thought about that, but yes, there's it does seem to me, when I think about stuff that's outside of news per se, this is more Galilean stuff, it doesn't seem to me to be much limit on what people can put into print about each other. I mean, certainly it's not codified in the way that we think of later on. Though I do think that the risk is strong that if you offend someone in a high place, then your stuff can get confiscated, or you can get jailed or decapitated or whatever. But yes, there does seem to be, when you read these things, some of the less sober ones, there's incredible sort of, range of insult that is permitted permitted. Though, in general, if you handwritten letters, you could say more. Printed was meant to be the place for you to be most careful, and handwritten letters you could be a little more free. And in theory, though this is not always true, what you say, just like this, would be free as the bulb, because you know there are no recording devices. In theory, that's how it went. That the permanence of the genre and the widespread of it would make it more dangerous. So printing 1,000 times and so and so is a jerk is more dangerous than having it written in 5 handwritten letters, which is still more dangerous than saying so and so is a jerk. Is the idea. Anyone else?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.